after the webinar is completed. And as you can just tell, we are also recording this webinar. And so we'll make that recording available, and we publish that on our YouTube site as well. We do like to keep these webinars as interactive as possible. So if you have questions that come up or something you want me to dive deeper on as we go through the webinar here, please do submit questions through the ReadyTalk webinar interface, and we'll take those as they come up. And then, of course, we've got time blocked at the end of the webinar to take additional questions and additional discussion points as they come up. So please do submit your questions through that ReadyTalk interface, and I'll take those as they come up. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. And as you may have noticed, if you just read what's going on in the media, you may wonder or may have the impression that the wearables market is tanking or the wearables market is in flux. Just some of the more recent announcements around, or recent news around Jawbone going out of business for all intents and purposes. They have restarted themselves as a healthcare-oriented company, but that's there seems to be a lot of uncertainty around that. So, but the consumer wearables business of Jawbone is now gone. Intel announced they are shutting down their wearables unit and shifting those resources to more AR and VR applications. And I think that the travails of Fitbit have been well documented in media, certainly. And so that's, I don't think I need to spend a whole lot of time on that. And there are other things that have been in the news recently that make the perception that the wearables market is in flux understandable, at least. But when you really pull back the layers of the onion and really look at what's going on in the market, there's much more to it than that, and much more reason to have a positive outlook on what's going on in the wearables market, at least underneath the surface, for things that are coming later this year, next year, and beyond. I like to think of what you're seeing here in the marketplace as kind of the beginning of the end of the first phase of wearables growth, and it's also the beginning of the next phase of wearables growth, which we'll certainly cover more in further slides here. But that first phase of wearables growth, particularly on the consumer side of things, was really focused on general activity tracking, step counting, calorie counting, overall telling people how much they moved around, encouraging them to stand up more, move around more, reach step goals. And all of those things were interesting for a while and valuable in getting people generally up and moving around more, and overall just increasing the level of awareness of how much people are moving or how little someone may be moving, and encouraging them to become more active, which that in and of itself is valuable at an individual level, but also, frankly, at a broader public health level as well, just to get people moving around more and more conscious of their overall activity levels. What the downside, though, is that information, once you get to a certain self-awareness, if you will, at an individual level, doesn't provide a whole lot of ongoing value. You generally know when you've been active enough in a given day, or how much activity or how much exercise or how much physical fitness you've been doing in a given day or in a given week. And you also know if you've been sitting on the couch the whole week. It doesn't tell you that the general activity tracking in terms of ongoing value it has been challenged to keep people engaged in the long term for telling people things they don't necessarily know about their health and fitness levels. And you can see how this the market grew up from going all the way back to the 80s in the ECG chest straps, which many people consider to be some of the first quote-unquote wearables, going all the way back, certainly wearable activity or health monitors, and all the way up through today's integrated solutions, whether that's smartwatches, high-end fitness bands, hearables, which is gaining a lot of traction in the market today. And what we're seeing is this transition into the next phase of wearables growth as the market and consumers in general become aware, much more aware of their health and fitness levels and the ability to track those levels on an ongoing basis. They're really looking for what's next and looking for guidance on how their activity levels are impacting their overall health beyond just showing people a number of how many steps they took or how many calories they burned. And so what we're seeing in this really setting the stage for this next phase of wearables growth is really defined by those deeper insights into personal health, fitness, and general wellness. And the primary way to identify, and the way I like to summarize this, by the way, is instead of just looking at how active a person has been or how many steps they've taken, where the real value starts to come in is being able to show people how their body is actually responding to whatever activities they are putting it through, whether that's sitting on the couch or running a marathon or something in between. And the best way to identify how someone's body is reacting to the activity they're putting it through is through biometric measurement. And the way you're starting to see this come into the market now and have in the last couple of years with things like optical heart rate monitors, but you're also seeing other biometric sensor systems coming into wearable devices and mobile devices today that can measure much more advanced metrics and give people much deeper insights into how their body is responding to their activity levels, what's making them healthier, what's making them less healthy, and providing the opportunity for not just the deeper individual insights in understanding how that person's body is responding, and by the way, responding meaning not just to a particular activity or exercise, but how they're responding over time in either seeing their health and fitness improving or declining, depending on what they might be doing. That at an individual level is interesting, but also provides the opportunity for broad population insights. And you're starting to see a bit of this come in today with some of the more advanced wearables trying to provide some compare and contrast at an individual level to the broader population insights. And that's why you see some of the wearables today providing insights like, let's say your resting heart rate is at the higher or 70% level according to other people in your age group or in your region or at your particular fitness level. You're starting to see some of that population compare and contrast to give people some perspective on how their fitness levels and their health levels compare to other people like them in some way. So that's really just scratching the surface of the possibilities there in terms of the broad population insights and, frankly, the deeper individual insights. Where we're seeing this going is getting to more of a predictive analytics capability where you start to see the ability for these devices to provide levels of prediction, guidance, and recommendations that are based on the biometric measurements on an ongoing basis, and give people the ability to gain some level of guidance or recommended change that's going to help them achieve a goal that they are trying to achieve, whether that's something like running a marathon, or even if it's just moving around more, improving their cardiovascular condition, maybe managing a particular health condition that they may have or be on the verge of having, something like hypertension or something along those lines. And so that at an individual level and a population level is interesting. At longer term, it provides the opportunity for really shifting healthcare delivery in a way that we haven't seen in the past. As we all know, today's healthcare delivery process is very ad hoc. It's very much point-in-time measurements. We all go to the doctor maybe once or twice a year, depending if that. I know I go probably less than that. But that's a very episodic approach to healthcare delivery, and you get a snapshot view, and your healthcare provider gets a snapshot view of your measurements and your particular condition at that time. And then they may not see you again for another year or two, and they'll get another snapshot at that point. But what we're seeing is a significant trend towards shifting this healthcare delivery towards being more proactive and continually measuring relevant biometric indicators that first and foremost provide a baseline of measurements for some of those key biometrics that provide those deeper insights, but then also give healthcare providers the ability to manage those populations by changes off of that baseline and deltas off of that baseline that can enable people to catch potentially dangerous conditions or shifts in their general health and wellness very early on, whereas they, in a more of an episodic approach, those conditions may not be identified in a timely manner, and those conditions progress, and it gets harder and more challenging to address those conditions the longer and longer you wait. So we're a long way from that predictive, continual healthcare delivery, certainly healthcare monitoring and then delivery approach. But you're starting to see now the foundations of that healthcare delivery process getting in place today. We'll talk more about that as we go along here. But what you're also seeing, so we've talked quite a bit about consumer electronics, and I touched a bit just a moment ago on more of the health and medical wearables. You are seeing a lot more of the traditional medical device companies, healthcare companies, even pharma companies getting involved in building wearable devices. Not many of those have come to market yet, but those projects are certainly in process. There's other areas where biometrics are proliferating in other markets as well. So areas like military, first responder, industrial safety is another big one where we're seeing a lot of activity. So think about really anyone in potentially dangerous work conditions, whether that's a soldier in the field for the military or a construction worker wearing a hard hat with a biometric sensor in that hard hat to provide real-time biometric feedback into a system that can identify potentially dangerous conditions or degradations in someone's health condition in real time in the field. AR and VR and certainly gaming and esports in particular are getting a lot of attention these days. This is another area where we're seeing quite a bit of activity. Again, not much in the market yet, but there are active development projects in all of these areas to incorporate biometric sensor systems to collect real-time data and in these AR and VR experiences and into things like gaming and esports activities. And you might think this is not necessarily all that game-changing, but when you think about how some of these AR and VR applications are being applied, there's some very interesting overlap going on as well with VR companies applying their technology to some of these other areas on this slide, specifically health and medical, and also military, first responder, and industrial safety, where just as one example, there's a company called First Hand Technologies that is utilizing a VR headset along with a biometric sensor system to do pain management in healthcare facilities today, and seeing significant reductions in pain for patients on the order of 30 to 40% pain reduction without any opioids or pain medications of any kind. And those, so you're seeing some fascinating overlap in these areas of utilizing real-time biometric feeds into a variety of different applications that go way beyond anything that the general perception around the quote-unquote wearables market identifies today. Most people think, when they think wearables, they think just smartwatches and fitness bands. There's a lot more going on here where wearable technology is being applied in a variety of different use cases that's having significant impact. So I'll focus just for the next couple of slides on this convergence going on between consumer electronics and the health and medical wearables, because that's likely to be some of the more near-term impact that you're going to see in the marketplace. And this is really centered around this notion of patient-generated health data, and this isn't specific to wearables necessarily. You can think of this, and as you can see here, the healthit.gov website defines it in this way. But it's really any health-related data that is collected outside of a medical facility to help address a health concern. And this has been around for a long time in a non-automated way, where people taking their blood pressure as an example and writing it down in a notebook, taking that notebook into their healthcare facility or into their doctor's office and showing their doctor the results. All of that's getting more and more automated these days, and not just on the blood pressure side of things, but certainly in other areas as well. And really any or all of the home health devices and connected health devices that are used outside of medical facilities today are connected to the internet in some way and feed that data back into a digital format in some way. And so you've got these really two segments of the market going after this opportunity. One, the consumer electronics companies are certainly recognizing that they need to move beyond just counting activity, counting steps, counting calories, and move into providing people these broader insights into their overall personal health and wellness. And you look at any of the recent announcements from the major players on the consumer electronics and the consumer wearable side of things, some of which are listed here. This is by no means a comprehensive list on either side. You look at any of the most recent announcements from these companies, and it is demonstrating a shift in moving towards more personal health devices as opposed to just activity tracking devices. On the other side of this, you have the health and medical companies, particularly some of the traditional medical device companies, pharma companies, health and wellness companies, who are recognizing this opportunity around patient-generated health data and are recognizing that they need to build devices that consumers wear outside of a medical facility, but can then still feed data back into either an electronic health record or a patient treatment protocol of some kind, depending on the specific condition or the use case or purpose behind the wearable device. But there's some of these you've seen come to market. Philips, as an example, has some devices out in the market today, but there are many others that are working on similar type devices, and devices targeted towards very specific health conditions or diseases or specific conditions that are trying to be measured and managed. And so I think you'll see, and this is a good example of, people talk about the wearables market as a monolithic market, primarily focused around consumers. And what we're seeing is a highly fragmented market addressed at a variety of different use cases, and in this case, health conditions or disease states. And so you'll see more and more quote-unquote wearables targeted towards very specific use cases, very specific conditions. But when you add up all of those niche devices, subsets, and different use cases and health conditions that these devices are going after, there's a large groundswell here of different devices for different applications that you'll see coming to market in the near future. What's interesting is there's a bit of friction, if you will, between the consumer wearables and the health and medical companies, and this really just comes back to the DNA of the companies and how they're set up, how they are traditionally go to market, their primary customer bases and design styles and go-to-market strategies. They're very different, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out with these two segments of the market going after the same opportunity. On the consumer side of things, it's obviously much more loose on the validation side of things. Accuracy is not necessarily a top priority, but getting consumer scale marketing and large ad campaigns and branding and styling are critical to those devices. Generally want to avoid FDA approval processes, and you see relatively short product timelines, both on the product development side of things and on the product lifecycle side of things. On the medical wearables aspect, these are some very large traditional medical device companies, some venture-backed companies, typically much more capital invested in these medical wearables companies, much more targeted B2B marketing and go-to-market strategies to go through to navigate the healthcare system and the complicated nature of the provider, payer, and device and wearable maker category of going to market with a device along these lines is far more complicated on that side of things. Certainly with regulated devices, with the FDA approval process in many cases being critical to success here, much longer product development cycles, but also much longer product life cycles once the device is in the market. So what you're seeing here is a mix of these two coming together underneath, under the surface here. You're seeing the medical device companies adopt some of the consumer ways of doing business, and on the consumer side of things, you're seeing them having to adopt some of the medical device approaches as well. So interesting to see how this plays out, certainly. There are certainly quite a few challenges in this next phase of wearables growth. These are just a few off the top. There are certainly many more that we could talk about, but we could talk all day about the challenges there. Right off the top here, the usability of these devices and the motivation behind the the users of these devices is a critical factor that often goes overlooked in terms of, and I always like to say inertia is an incredibly powerful force, and it certainly applies here in getting people to use devices consistently in the long term, that, and even if they recognize that these devices will help them live longer, healthier lives, it's still extremely challenging to get people to change their habits, identify what's making them more healthy, and change the things that are making them less healthy. And so we should not underestimate those challenges in making these devices not just as easy to use as possible, but for the individual user, but almost just as importantly is making sure that the data that these devices are generating gets into a meaningful context for the right people at the right time. The validation of that data is a critical point, particularly on the provider side of things. There's a lot of skepticism in the market about the levels of accuracy of some of these wearable devices and the believability of the data. I think there's quite a bit of I guess education in the market and different perspective required in the market for there's a big difference between getting a particular biometric reading at a point in time in a healthcare facility and requiring absolute 100% accuracy for those measurements, and then comparing that to broad-scale longitudinal data that comes in from a device that someone's wearing on a 24/7 basis. That data still has value. It may not be 100% accurate like the medical grade devices are, but is the level of accuracy enough to provide value for those healthcare providers to provide better recommendations, better diagnoses, and ultimately better care to their patients. That certainly varies by use case, by device, and by the disease state or the condition being managed. But there's a lot of conversation and debate going on as to how accurate is accurate enough for these different devices. And it changes the discussion from looking at point-in-time measurements to these longitudinal data sets that can provide different types of insights once you get to a certain threshold of accuracy. And of course, all of these things need to be clinically validated and studied for their particular use case, for the particular disease state or condition being managed. On the data integration side of things, there's still huge amounts of work to do here in getting the right data to the right person at the right time in the right context. The last thing healthcare providers need is to be flooded with data from wearable devices from all of their patients if that data doesn't provide any meaningful or actionable insights into what's going on and how that applies to that particular patient in the context of the overall healthcare delivery process. So there's a bunch of different companies working on this now, but it's still there's still a long way to go in integrating this data. And it's more than just integrating the data, it's integrating the data and then turning that data into actionable insights that can actually streamline and improve the care delivery process, as opposed to just being a flood of data that is only going to add time and frustration to the process. So those are just a few of the challenges, none of them insignificant by any means, and there are certainly a lot more we could go on, but in the interest of time, I'll move on here. And we get asked this question quite a bit of So the technologies there, what's taking so long for this next phase of growth in the wearables market? Why it seems like this transition process is ongoing with little end in sight, and that's there's a few reasons. Again, these are just a few of the top reasons we see in our day-to-day activities. And one is that the companies involved in the first phase of wearables, particularly the consumer electronics companies, they are extremely good at making devices that people like to wear and use on a 24/7 basis in general. What's very different about the wearables market is these devices actually generate data as opposed to just consuming and presenting data like most consumer electronics do. Wearables are very different in that they generate data, and in order for the user experience to be compelling on an ongoing basis, that data needs to be turned into a user experience that provides value on an ongoing basis, not just how many steps did I take today. Well, I have a pretty good idea of how many steps I took because I've been wearing this device for 3 months, but now what? What's next? And so the interesting thing now that we're starting to see some different types of companies getting involved in the wearables market who know more about what to do with the data, how to present that data and those insights in a more compelling way on an ongoing basis. We are starting to see change there, certainly. Another interesting thing is that the hardware has been well ahead of the software and the user experiences, at least in terms of what's available in the market today. So the example I like to use here is, and there's been some news reports about this recently, around atrial fibrillation as a good example. The biometric sensor systems that are incorporated into many different wearables today have the ability and have had the ability to detect atrial fibrillation for years now. In fact, Valencell demonstrated this in our booth at CES 2 years ago, if not more than that. And so that, from a hardware standpoint, that capability has been there for quite a while, but you still don't see that type of user experience in the marketplace today. There's other complicating factors, of course, with that specific use case with atrial fibrillation. But another good example is VO2 or VO2 max, which is a proxy for someone's cardiovascular health and fitness conditions. And you are starting to see that now come into some of the more advanced sports and fitness use cases for these wearable devices. But again, that capability has been around for many, many years to be able to estimate and more specifically measure someone's VO2 and VO2 max in a wearable device. So we're starting to see this come around now, where the software and the user experiences are starting to take more advantage of what's there and what's capable from a hardware technology standpoint. The last thing is another one that's certainly not insignificant, and that's simply the individualized guidance, which is what many consumers want. If you look at a lot of the data as to why people have tried wearables and no longer use the wearables, and in the case that they don't use them anymore, a lot of what they're looking for and a lot of the feedback you see is it didn't provide ongoing value for me as an individual. It didn't provide any guidance or it didn't tell me anything new. And the challenge here is that every person is different, and that certainly applies as it relates to wearables as well. And that is that's a challenge that will be around for quite a while, in that identifying, you can measure all kinds of biometrics about an individual person, but knowing the additional context and additional information about where that person is, what they've been doing, what they've been eating, what they've been drinking, all of those things feed into that the effectiveness of that individualized guidance, and it's frankly just very difficult to provide that guidance. Think about even personal trainers have trouble with this, even though they see their clients and customers in person on a regular basis. They get that direct interaction with those people. Same thing with healthcare providers, and that individualized guidance is still very challenging. So wearable devices of all kinds are helping to paint a broader picture of a person's overall health and wellness, but the individualized guidance is still very much a work in progress. So the next question after this one we usually get is, so what makes us so confident that this is going to happen? First and foremost, it's happening now. Valencell's in a unique position in the wearables market. We are what they call an ingredient technology provider. So we usually get involved, meaning our core technology that measures biometrics and wearables is an ingredient to these wearable devices. And so we typically get involved in these wearable device projects about 18 to 24 months before they actually come to market. And that's on the consumer wearables and hearables side of things. On the medical device side of things, that as I mentioned before, those are much longer product development cycles. But I can tell you it is happening now, and that there is significant progress being made across many of the fronts that I've talked about here today. And so you don't yet see a lot of that progress in the market today, but it's coming, and there's a significant amount of work being done on broadening what the market perceives today as quote unquote the wearables market. So that's one thing. The second thing is, what's interesting here is in the first phase of wearables, in many ways the first phase of wearable devices, primarily the activity trackers, were in many ways a solution looking for a problem. And in this next phase of wearables growth, what we're seeing is this technology being applied to well-known problems. So the outcomes that are desired are very well known. What's different here is applying technology in different ways to be able to address known problems in a more effective manner. So the health and wellness example is certainly one I talked about before in terms of that shift to more of a continual or ongoing tracking of a person's health and wellness. But other areas like the industrial safety is another good example of applying known technology to known problems in different ways that and it very well is going to emerge in across a variety of different sectors and subsectors of different markets. But it's the same technology just applied in different ways to different problems. And so anytime you have a known problem with where you can apply a technology that's been demonstrated in other cases to be able to solve that problem, it's obviously a much more effective approach than a solution looking for a problem. And last but certainly not least is the technical and market dynamics going on are all trending positive. So there's a couple of things here that I'll talk about. On the technical side of things, just in the last few years, particularly on the biometric side of things, but certainly in other areas as well, there's been huge advances in the capabilities of these biometric sensor systems and in general wearable device sensor systems to be able to address these different problems with a high degree of accuracy in a variety of different form factors, a variety of different use cases. So many of the technical challenges have been solved. There's certainly many more to go, but many of the big hurdles from a technical standpoint in terms of making this technology wearable and usable in when people are moving around in difficult conditions in a variety of different form factors, all of those things are have been addressed in many ways. And from a market dynamic standpoint, it's you're starting. I touched on this earlier, but you're starting to see a much more diverse group of companies with a diverse group of capabilities starting to apply these technologies in ways that have not been applied before to, again, solve known problems in different ways. And so if you think about the ability to apply this technology and these devices to a variety of different problems, and then open up that capability and those data sets to potentially look at problems that may not have been solved or not been able to be solved before. I'll show you, or I'll discuss a very specific example, and that's one with a company called Cardiogram, who is taking Apple Watch data and applying it to atrial fib and arrhythmia use cases. And this is an example of a data set from Apple Watches and a separate company, and a company called Cardiogram, who is leveraging that data, applying machine learning and AI to that data, and finding a way to solve new problems with existing data. And so you're starting to see a lot of this overlap and convergence, if you will, between certainly the consumer and the health and medical side of things, but also other markets and other applications that are driving the ability to make advancements here that really solve significant problems, and also open up new opportunities to solve challenges that we haven't been able to before. So we are, I'm showing about 15 minutes to the top of the hour, and I wanted to, and by the way, that was all we had in terms of prepared slides, but I also wanted to open it up for questions, and it looks like we've got a few questions that have come in as we went along here. Sorry, I missed those as they came in. First question would be, I knew it. The first question that came in was, will we be sharing the presentation at the end of the webinar? And for those of you who may have joined late, yes, we will be sharing the slides from the webinar, and also we've been recording the webinar, and we'll put that on our YouTube channel as well and get that out to all of you. So please do feel free to share it with any of your colleagues who may not have been able to join us today, or also anyone else who you think might be interested. Second question, it looks like, not necessarily a question, but a comment, and it's a good one. I would challenge your statement that style and branding are irrelevant in the medical space. People don't want to wear don't want wearables that look medical. I absolutely agree. I was speaking more from a historical context. You're absolutely right. That is starting to change in terms of more of the medical devices having more style and branding to them, because you're absolutely right. People don't want to wear a device that obviously showcases or highlights a particular health condition they may be trying to manage. Hearing aids are a perfect example of this. You've seen tremendous strides in the hearing aid side of the market, where they used to be big and very obvious that someone was wearing a hearing aid, and you've seen significant amounts of miniaturization and new capabilities being integrated into hearing aids to where in many cases you can't necessarily see if someone's wearing a hearing aid at that time, and those same dynamics are being applied across the medical device space as well. So great point. I should have clarified that more, but you're absolutely right. Next question. So great questions, by the way. Keep them coming. Um, Next question is, what's the most interesting new wearable technology that people are experimenting with? Really good question. I think that answer depends on your perspective. I think there's a few that I think are most interesting and have certainly been validated by the customers and prospective customers we talk to all the time. Just off the top of my head, there's been significant progress in measuring blood pressure in different ways, and in particular using the same sensor technology, optical sensor technology that goes into consumer wearables, just applied to measuring blood pressure. And given the amount of, or the number of people that are hypertensive or pre-hypertensive, and the amount of time and effort and resources it takes to manage those conditions, and even just to continually monitor those conditions, there's some very interesting work going on in being able to measure blood pressure accurately in a much easier format. There's also interesting work going on related to hydration and hydration monitoring, that not just on the sports and fitness side of things, but also in just day-to-day life, day-to-day activities, being able to measure hydration levels in a way. You got to be very careful with the way you measure hydration and what is actually being measured. There's a big difference between muscle hydration, as an example, and the blood osmolality, the actual hydration and the amount of water in the blood. So those are two off the top of my head. I would say from a more technical perspective, there's some very interesting developments that may not be all that exciting on the surface, but are certainly going to really change the capabilities and the applications of these devices. One is around power management, so the ability to leverage these biometric sensors at much lower power, which obviously is really important for these wearable devices that only have a relatively small amount of real estate to work with, and the battery size is always a limiting factor. So the more you can get out of these biometric sensors for less power, obviously, the better. And then also there is quite a bit of interesting new development work going on in making this technology even more wearable, and specifically more motion tolerant. More wearable, that's not all that descriptive. More motion tolerant. And as you put these devices on people who are doing all kinds of different things in different environments, different conditions, many of these devices are very sensitive to motion, and so the more motion tolerant you can make it, the better. We've made quite a few strides in that area, but there's still a lot more work to do in that space, and there's some compelling developments going on there. And then, so that I think off the top of my head answers that question. Next question is, what technology is on the cusp of being incorporated into a commercial product that is innovative? I'd say it depends on what you mean by on the cusp, but I would define that as in the next 18 months or so. And I think those technologies that I just talked about would certainly apply to being on the cusp. And obviously, there's still a lot of work to do on the technology development side, but then also it's one thing to make that technology work on a bench or in the lab. It's a whole other thing to make that technology integrated into a commercial device that is scalable to thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of units, and that's where a lot of that work is going on right now. The next question: what would you say is the next event happening in using motion-based information? Another good question. So motion-based information meaning accelerometry data, I believe. So identifying what motion and what activity levels are going on based on the measurements coming off the device. So there's a few things going on here. One, there's a lot of work going on around fall detection. So particularly for the aging population and seniors, there's a lot of work going on using motion. And there are some devices on the market now. Frankly, what we've seen is they're not all that good at detecting falls. So there is some good work being done there to help improve that process. And I'd say that's on the health and medical side of things, what we're seeing most often. The other area where I'd say that the accelerometry data is being used most is in activity identification. So this is more on the sports and fitness side of things, but also has applications in the AR and VR devices, also in industrial safety. So activity identification, meaning in the sports and fitness use case, give an example of identifying when someone is running, when they're biking, when they're doing a push-up or doing a pull-up, being able to accurately track exactly what a person's doing and how many in the sports and fitness use cases, how many reps they're doing, that kind of stuff. Again, there's solutions on the market that do that. Some of them better than others, but there's a lot more work going on there as well. The other area, well, I guess the other data point I would point out there is we've had a significant increase. So just speaking about valence cells specifically for a moment, our standard biometric sensor system has an accelerometer in it, and we've seen a significant increase in the requests for raw accelerometry data. We utilize the accelerometry data in contextualizing the biometric data, but we've seen a significant increase in the amount of requests for access to the raw accelerometry data, and it's for exactly these purposes, and using that raw accelerometry data for other purposes in identifying activities or identifying incidents like a fall or something along those lines. So hopefully that helps. Looks like the last question here. Any thoughts on implantables? Interesting. So I watch that area of the market pretty closely because I happen to be one of those people who might put an implantable device in my body very soon if I was comfortable with where the technology is, and I'm not there yet. So it's interesting. We still haven't seen. There's a lot of experiments going on in that area. We still haven't seen anyone solve one of the biggest challenges at scale, which is the body rejecting the implantable device, if not immediately, then over time. And there's a technical term for it, and I'm just drawing a blank on it right now. This is where I wish Dr. LaBeouf was on. He would know the term right off the top of his head. But so I think there's a lot of potential for implantables if and when someone can solve that rejection issue, and particularly over the long term. That obviously with an implantable, you don't want something that you have to replace in any short time frame. So. To that end, there's still quite a bit of work to do on that front, but there's certainly a lot of potential there as well in terms of the different types of analysis that would be able to be done with an implantable. Obviously, the chemical analysis that is available with things like continuous glucose monitors that are invasive to a certain extent, that there's a ton of opportunity there with implantables, certainly above and beyond just glucose monitoring. It looks like we got one last question in just a couple of minutes here, so I'll try to answer this one quickly. And I think my answer may go over time, so I will pause and say thanks everyone for taking the time to attend the webinar. We hope this was valuable for you. And as I mentioned, we'll be getting the slides and the recording out, so please do share that with anyone you think might be interested. So many thanks for your time. Last question here is, in terms of fall detection, what would you say are the biggest pitfalls when applying that to populations other than the elderly? Biggest pitfalls, I would say one of the biggest challenges that we have that we haven't seen addressed effectively. Again, it's highly dependent on the use case and the kind of conditions and environments that the device is being used in. But outside of the elderly populations, we haven't seen the accuracy levels needed in identifying when falls happen. So there's with the elderly population, they're not all that active to begin with. So you can identify anomalies much easier than you can in a more active population. And so that's one of the biggest challenges we've seen in the fall detection, particularly if, again, depending on the use case and the form factor, someone or the user of that device is fairly active to begin with. The other thing we have seen is in that same vein is in terms of challenges identifying the falls is where the device is located. So somewhere like the wrist, which many people like to wear things on their wrist, whether it's a watch or a fitness band or activity tracker, whatever it might be. But there's a lot of local motion that happens at the wrist. Your arms and hands and wrists tend to be in motion quite a bit. Even when you're sitting still, there's a lot of things, even something as simple as typing can throw off some of these sensors because of the bone, muscle, and tendon flexibility and motion that's going on in that location. You contrast that with somewhere on the torso or potentially somewhere on the head where there's far less local motion. That's where we've seen the better applications of that technology emerge. But again, if that's depending on your use case, that may or may not be possible. I will say, and that reminds me, I should have put this up earlier. If you'd like to talk about any of this in more detail, or if there's follow-up questions that you may have that I didn't get to here, please do feel free to reach out to me on any of these channels, and I would be happy to discuss further. And as you could probably tell, I'm by no means the technical expert in the company. So, but we do have we do have a tremendous amount of engineering and sensor technology expertise in the company. I would be happy to get you in touch with the right person that can answer any questions you may have. So I will close by saying thanks again. I really appreciate your time and interest. And if there's anything we can help with or anything you'd like to discuss further, please don't hesitate to reach out. But otherwise, have a great day, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Please stand by.